Hey, I want to thank you for joining us on another episode of Disruption Now. This is a special episode. The book that we're talking about is Color Him Father, and it's about Black fatherhood, but particularly Black fatherhood and loss. And when we were taping this, my sister, my big sister, was in the middle of struggling to overcome the flu. Now, she was born with a chronic heart condition, but she's been a fighter all her life, and she's gotten past so many times when it looked like she wasn't going to make it. So we always were optimistic and assumed she was going to make it past this, but this time she didn't. So in the midst of talking about Black fatherhood, talking about families, we ended up losing my sister just a little while later. And seeing my family go through that has been hard. Going through it myself has been hard. It's really the first time I have seen death up close and personal. And I'm thankful my sister was in a better place, but it's a new experience. And I think it opened up my mind to how much we need to talk about these things and be vulnerable and understand that's a part of the process. It doesn't make you less of a man to cry. It doesn't make you less of a man to not understand. And this was a hard thing to go through in this moment for me, but these men, as you'll hear in the story, went through stories that were just as hard or harder, and they found a way through. And they're disrupting this narrative that the Black male is absent from their family. They're not. We just don't hear the stories, and that's our job to really disrupt that. So I want to give a prayer out to my sister. We'll actually be doing her homecoming funeral this weekend. So I hope you enjoy the show, and I hope you gain some insight from it, and I hope you can learn or see yourself somewhere in this. Have a blessed one.
When Kia passed away, one of the challenges, Kia, my daughter, I was struck by the fact that, like anyone else, when something like that happens, some kind of trauma like that in your life, you start searching for answers. You start searching for material. You start anything that you can grasp that sort of helps you begin to make sense of it. Even though I'm a psychologist, obviously I couldn't treat myself, so I needed to.
But they tell lawyers too, don't be your own lawyer. I'm a lawyer, but it's a bad idea. Don't do that. If you believe we can change the narrative, if you believe we can change our communities, if you believe we can change the outcomes, then we can change the world. I'm Rob Richardson. Welcome to Disruption Now. Welcome to Disruption Now. I'm Rob Richardson. We like to disrupt common narratives and constructs here, and I think you're going to really enjoy this podcast today because it certainly does that. We have Dr. Lawrence Drake with us, who is the author of Color Him Father, also one of the, people that tell their story is Michael Bennett, who's also in the book. And this has been a great book, I think, really to try to really disrupt the narratives that are around Black males as fathers, that Black males are absent as fathers. That's something you hear all the time in the media. It's not something you're going to hear on Disruption Now. One, it's said all the time, and two, it's not true. And we're going to talk about that today and really talk about it from the experience of what it means to be a Black man who is invested in his child's life, what it's actually like to go through tragedy, what it's like to also not be perfect. Look, I think all three of us here have been divorced before, have had our own challenges. And at Disruption, we like to have real conversations about our community because I don't think we can really go about changing constructs or changing our community until we actually have honest input, honest conversations. So that's what brings us here today. And I'll tell you, Color Him Father really was a transformative book for me. It is a hard book to read, but it's a great book, and I think it's a necessary book for everyone, I think for white families too, but especially Black families, because we can talk about trying to change the narrative, to try to get America to change the narrative, but change starts with us. It starts internally, it starts with our community. This book really helps to do that and really is a really in-depth look at what it means to be a father, what it means to be a Black male, what it means to be vulnerable. And I think you're going to really enjoy this discussion, and I'd highly encourage you to get the book. So, gentlemen, welcome here. It's good to have you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you,
Rob.
Good to see you this afternoon.
Yeah, so always good to be back in D.C. I saw this book, Dr. Lawrence, and I wanted, as a way, as I explained earlier, I saw it as more than the stories. The stories were hard, as I told Michael. They were hard to get through, but they were necessary. But I saw it as more than the stories that were obviously emotional, that were obviously tragic. I saw this as a kind of a blueprint to disrupt the narratives about what it means to be a black male father in America. That's what I saw this as. But take us through why you wrote this book and why you wrote it in the way you did, in terms of not only telling your story, but telling stories of other black male fathers who had, similar stories to yourself. Like, what brought that to your mind, and why did you do that?
Yeah, so when I when Kia passed away, one of the challenges, Kia, my daughter, I was struck by the fact that, like anyone else, when something like that happens, some kind of trauma like that in your life, you start searching for answers. You start searching for material. You start anything that you can grasp that sort of helps you begin to make sense of it. Even though I'm a psychologist, obviously I couldn't treat myself, so I needed to.
That's what they tell lawyers too. Don't be your own lawyer. I'm a lawyer, but it's a bad idea. Don't do that.
It's not good. So I started looking, and there was really nothing for me that spoke to me as a father, and more specifically as a black father. But the irony of it all is I knew 10 other black men who had also lost their children. And my first inclination was actually to approach the book from a scholarly perspective, to actually do qualitative interviews with families and really talk about loss, because one of the other stereotypical but yet actual factual anecdotes about the black family is that we don't seek mental health counseling.
Yeah, I think and we're going to talk about that in detail some. So hold that thought before you go down that rabbit hole. But I definitely agree.
But because of that, I thought, well, okay, if I do that, then it's going to be exposed to a journal, and the scholars and the academics will read the journal, but nobody else will.
Right.
And I said, well, that's not going to work. And plus, I can't really speak in a real-time, honest and authentic voice as a black father when I'm operating as a scholar. Just the framework in which you do research in the academic community is not the same.
Well, and I think it's one of the challenges of people who communicate, who think just because you have great information that it will be relayed to the human brain.
Correct.
It's about converting hearts and minds, not minds and hearts.
Exactly.
So if you don't tell the story in a way that connects,
right,
your point never gets through. So that's a great point.
Right. So after that, I realized that I knew these men, 10 of them, and they were all my friends. They were all people I knew. Some of them I had known for as long as 50 years. And so I said, look, if I'm going to write this book, it needs to accomplish at least 3 things. One is it needs to celebrate our children. I don't want my daughter, nor the children of the other men who contributed to the book, to feel that this was just an exercise in talking about what happened.
Right.
But it's really an exercise in celebrating our children, making sure that the footprint that they'd left in this world was going to be here in perpetuity.
Is that why you talk about Kia in present tense? So I know it's something you do in the book. You say that you mention her as present right now.
Yes.
The reason for that is because of what you just celebrate her life and make sure that folks know the impact she has continually.
Yes, and Michael and I have a very similar view. People will ask us, they ask me how many children I have, and I say I have 5, even though that Kia is not physically here.
Right.
She's still my oldest, and she's one of the 5. And the point is that I want people to understand that she's present. So that's one. The second reason was I wanted to talk about dispelling this myth about black fatherhood in real time.
Right.
This idea that black fathers are not present, that they're not attentive to their children. And of course, we even had some most recent research that Pew did that really talks about the fact that black fathers, even if they're not with the mothers, are more present than their white counterparts.
Yeah.
Then thirdly, I wanted to be able to speak to this idea that black fathers, excuse me, that young men who were not fathers yet, that they could see in us themselves.
Oh.
And they could see that, okay, if he's going through that and this is what he's been through, should I have to ever face a tragedy like that, how would I handle it? But more importantly, how do I need to think about myself? Because since 1619, black fathers have been excluded from the family purposely.
Right.
And I want them to understand that fact. So those 3 objectives really were the impetus and, more importantly, the foundation for writing the book.
So, Michael, how did you, obviously you know each other, but how did you get yourself to write this book, given what you went through? I mean, it's it's hard. I'm sure it's still hard to talk about. How did you get yourself there, and why did you do it?
Well, I guess, and I want to comment on Larry's point about our daughters being present. Larry, Kia transitioned about 2 months before Krista did, and I didn't know that Kia was transitioning then, and I don't think Larry knew like where we were with regard to Krista. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, and I am adamant about the fact that Krista's here.
Right.
She simply transitioned, and it's not just because she's in my memory. She's actually with me and having an impact. Her legacy is here, of which I have a 5-year-old granddaughter that is Krista's daughter. But
and that's such an interesting story that, you talk about this more, but I remember this point in the book where you knew it was coming towards the end, and then your daughter popped the question and said, "Look, I'm going to give you joint custody with your ex-wife." I said, "Wow."
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, of course, you have no choice, but you're going to do it.
I said, that's a really odd thing to do. She said, "Well, yeah," but I said, "Well, we got divorced. You give my ex-wife and I are going to have joint custody of our granddaughter." She said, "Dad, work it out."
Yeah. And what you gonna say? No, you got nothing to say.
And so, but for me, it was the most profound conversation that Larry and I started out with on the book, because I really was, and I always tease him about it, I was an afterthought, we're not going to get into that today.
No, we're not saying that.
But
well, you were the second one mentioned, so you're the first one after him.
But Larry, Krista is a singer and actor, and her profession was musical theater. And her very first professional play when she was in college was a play called Once on This Island.
Yeah.
And it was on Broadway. It had won a Tony for Best Musical Revival in 2018. So I said, I've got to see this. Krista actually won, or was, I guess "one" is the right word, the lead when she was 19 years old, and she went to audition just for a bit part, and she was so thrilled to be able to win the lead with all these professional actors there in Chicago. But at any rate, I was in New York and waiting for my wife to finish getting dressed to walk across the street to go see Once on This Island, and my cell phone rang. Larry and I don't talk a lot by cell phone, so I saw the number. It says from Atlanta. Who is this? So anyway, I answered, and it's Larry.
Right.
And he started telling me about the book project, and if I would be interested / willing to participate.
Right.
And he said he had I think 3 conversations with other people who said, "You've got to get Michael Bennett in this book." And I'm waiting to go across the street to see my daughter's first professional production.
Right.
And I mean, and the answer was, of course.
Right.
I have to do that. I mean, it was just profound. And Krista tended to play with me.
Right.
And I won't do a spoiler with regard to her story in the book, but it was and Larry had absolutely no idea where I was, no idea what was happening, and so that conversation at that time was just was really clear to me. This was something that I had to do and that Krista wanted me to do, and so we did. I have to say it was probably some of the toughest and best times that I had writing that chapter. And I probably went through 15 drafts of versions. I started trying to do it during the day and I just couldn't.
Yeah.
So I would do the drafts, the writing and the rewriting. I start about 10 o'clock at night.
Right.
And I would generally work on it most of the night.
Right.
And because of the laughter and the tears and everything else. So it was beyond therapeutic.
Right.
It actually established another level of relationship.
Yeah, something that really kind of stuck out to me in the book, and you both had this, whether it was intentional or not, I saw it in your stories, I saw it in all the stories, was this fact of this struggle. And I see it now myself as a father, right? You a balance between pushing your kids and then figuring out where they actually are and where they need to be based upon their unique personalities.
Yeah.
Versus pushing them to where you want them to be for your own ego satisfaction.
Right.
At least I can say that's what I drew out of this.
Yeah.
I thought about Kia, her making that winning shot when you talked about her.
Yeah.
She's in the books, she makes a winning shot,
right.
and it said, I don't want to do this anymore. And I can think of myself as a parent, what do you mean? The first thing I'd say,
right.
you are going. What do you mean? Like,
exactly.
because I'm into basketball, I'm a basketball
right.
coach. Like,
right. Exactly.
I'm like, no, you're gonna go back, and that's what I'm just telling you what I was really thinking.
No,
I'm just being very honest, right?
I had the exact same reaction as a point.
And I want you to talk about that. And you had a similar one. And I can tell that Krista had challenges figuring out what she wanted to do. Sometimes the motivation, and you're like, you probably thought she was going to be X, Y, Z. Krista had a whole other path about what she's going to do. It is not Absolutely. What you had in mind. And I'm asking this for the other parents, people listening, and I'm asking for myself, right? How do you find that right balance? Because there is you want to make sure your kids are okay, they can take care of themselves, and they're going to have the right motivation and they have the right mindset, versus letting them be their own unique personality. I find it kind of hard. I mean, looking back now that you've had this whole experience, what do you draw from that to give advice to both of you? I'd like to hear it for myself and for everyone else.
I'll let Michael go first, and then I'll give you my 2 cents.
I tell you, one of the things I learned in this process was that everybody's got their own path, and we have to be really careful not to see someone else's life, even your child, through your filter. The reality is everything that you see and your whole perspective in life is driven by your own filter. Your experiences and how you see and what you think is good and not good. And, everybody deserves the right to travel their path. Yeah. And so one of the things that I end up doing with Krista, and I had at the time 3 children that I had to do. So by the time I got to Krista, she was number 3. I had a little experience with that wall in my head. So you really have to try and see their life as best you can through their filter, and be there to support and to guide as best you can, but not to try to create the path for them. And so that's one of the things that if you take a look particularly at Kia's story, and I think Krista's story too, and maybe some throughout all, is you've got to be careful to make sure that you acknowledge and support their path. Right. And that's hard to do.
That's very hard to do. I'm asking how do you do that I agree with what you're saying in theory.
But in practice, it's about, practice, for me, it was about biting my tongue a lot. I remember Krista's mom and I end up divorcing right at her senior year. Right. And I took all the kids to school, and so I continued to take her to school, and I let her talk while we were in the car. And I would not respond to anything. And so she would tell me all kinds of stuff. Right. And I'd sometimes tell her mother if I thought she was getting a little too close to the edge. Right. But at the end of the day, you really have to give them an opportunity to be themselves. The other thing that I will add to that, and I'll shut up, is that in order for you to do that, and in order for them to feel comfortable traveling their path with you, or traveling their path in front of you, you've got to give them a bird's eye view into who you are. You've got to let them see the real person, because your children are going to put you on a pedestal. And what they see is the result of all of the garbage that you've been through, or that we've been through, I'll say. And they don't know that you went through the same kind of things that they did. Right. And it's important for them to get to know you.
Yeah,
I spent a lot of time trying to make sure, particularly even prior to the divorce, but when the relationship started to really deteriorate, but getting to so that they knew me. Right. And that they didn't have any misconceptions about who I was. Right. At that point, then they're able to tell you and show you who they are.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that. There's in the book I talk about this idea of rage and vulnerability.
Yep.
And this idea of rage is something that we don't allow the kids to see except when they're not doing what we tell them to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
That's a good point.
But then on the vulnerability side, we don't show them our foibles. We don't show them our mistakes.
No, it's something that we don't want to. Right. We feel like that's not being a man. It's not being, especially a black man. You have to be even stronger.
Right.
And we have to present this united front where a man never shows vulnerability. Right. A man never cries.
And that's a dangerous thing, because I think that the one thing that is clear to me more now than ever is this idea of how much courage it takes to be vulnerable for us. That we actually have to have more courage to be vulnerable. And I think we have to teach our children this. I think what happened towards the last leg of Kia's journey is that we had a lot of conversation about my vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
About, I know you think your dad can do anything, but your dad's really... she said, well, I don't think you're perfect, Dad. And I said, no, but you know that. I said, but I really want you to understand how difficult it is for me. And I talk about in the book this one moment just after she had the surgery. She was back in her room, and she had all these tubes coming out of her. And I was standing there at her bedside holding her hand. And she said, Dad, can you believe I'm alive? I made it through. And I said, yeah, honey, of course. I said, you're going to conquer this thing. But she saw something in my face that I had no idea was there. It was that I was scared. I was just terrified at all these tubes that were coming out of her body. Yeah. And she said to me, Dad, why are you looking at me like that? I mean, because she picked it up. I had no clue that that's what I was giving off. And I said, I guess I just hate to see all these tubes coming out of my little girl. And when she raised up out of that bed, all of about 97 pounds, and pulled me close to her, and I could feel her ribs. That's how skinny she had become at this point. And she was hugging me as hard as her strength would allow. That was a teachable moment for me, because that said that she was saying to me, Dad, it's okay for you to be vulnerable with me in this moment. It's okay. And you don't need to feel bad that you feel bad. Know that I'm here for you too. We're not children, and Michael B's had, moments like that with Krista. Yeah. All of the fathers throughout the book have had those moments. They're remarkable moments. They're moments that you never forget. If you notice that most of us can tell you the day and almost the time in which they left and transitioned to the other place, to the other side physically, because those things are indelibly emblazoned in your mind, as well as different things on that journey. But I would say that, to answer your question, really being able to have the courage to be vulnerable is the number one way in which the agency of our children gets released. Right. Because they have to feel like they have agency, that they're in control of their own destiny. We're just guides. And the older that I get and the older my children get, the more I realize that. Right. The more I realize that it's not my job to raise them. I did some of that very early on. Right. And the older they get, they take more authority over, and they want more agency. Sure. So then you just become a guide. It's like taking a journey and you're the guide and not the person telling them what to study while they're on the journey. Yeah. That's a very different way to parent. But it is the way that I think we allow ourselves and our children to grow and become who they truly want to be.
So, this brings up a lot of great points about mental health. And you think about like that, as you said, a lot of black men are in between that balance of rage and vulnerability, rarely going to the vulnerability. and that's creating more issues and more vulnerability, frankly.
Yeah.
How do we go about that as a community to think about how we tackle that really? And how would you, knowing your experience now, because you've gone through an obviously life-changing, both of you, traumatic experience, I would ask the question this way. Seeing, if you can go back to your younger self, this will help us too, knowing what you know now about vulnerability, what would you say to yourself then?
Wow.
Can I answer that first?
Yeah, go ahead,
And let you think.
Yeah.
I would say to myself, give yourself a break. You don't have all the answers. And I think to listening to Larry and talk about Kia, and one of the things that Krista and I experienced, particularly Krista had osteosarcoma. It was about a 3.5 year journey. Particularly in that second half of the journey, I had to be real clear. I didn't have all the answers about things. And it was enough to be there. It was enough to be present. Mm-hmm. One of the things, I did a recording at Krista's, that was played at Krista's service, and I thank God for allowing me to be her father. And I also thank God for allowing me to do or to think I was doing what I really love. The thing that I love more than anything, and I mean that sincere, more than anything in life, is being a father. Mm-hmm. That is the single biggest joy in my life. Mm-hmm. And God allowed me to believe that I was Krista's protector and her teacher. The reality is God was her protector, and God was her teacher. Right. And it was just an illusion for me that made me feel good. But once you, and it doesn't mean that you don't continue to try to do those things. Yeah. But if you recognize that you don't really have the power to do but so much of that anyway, and you're simply acting as a vessel for God, and God is doing both those things in other ways other than just through you, then you can relax and just simply do the best that you can. And, and because the reality is, I tell my kids all the time, my job was like the guy who was trying to get this big pane of glass from one side of the room to the other. My hands are greasy and dirty and all that. My job is to get that glass from one side of the room to the other and don't drop the glass. Right. But by the time you get to the other side of the room, it's going to be messy and nasty and dirty and all kinds of stuff. But don't drop the glass. Right. And God is the one that cleans up the glass on the other side. And so Krista said to me in the last week that she was in the hospital, and we never saw anything as the last, right? But last week she was in the hospital. On that Wednesday, she transitioned on Saturday. On that Wednesday, I came in and I said, baby, I want to do something, but I don't know what to do. And God said, just be there. She said, well, Dad, if God told you just to stand, well, then just stand. Just be here. And that's enough. Right. So anyway, I talk more than I wanted to.
Listen,
but
it's
just about just be there. Right. Give yourself a break. You don't have to solve the problems. You don't have to be everything to everybody. Right. But you got to show up.
And it's hard for people that, for men, and again, black men who have also been successful in some ways. You overcome all of these barriers, all of these constructs, and you feel like, okay, I have to do this. I have to do all of this. This is what I'm supposed to do. I have to figure out a way to solve this. And when you can't, you feel probably, I imagine, I would just talk about how I would feel, and extremely depressed and defeated.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of black men who know they don't have but so much capability, and they believe that they're supposed to walk in with all the answers, they don't even bother walking in.
A lot of times,
that's a problem
that's
too.
That's at the genesis of why people do give up, because they recognize their frailties, but they exaggerate them to such a degree as they miss what they can do, because of what they think they can't do, and that's a pressure that we put on ourselves as men, and as black men particularly. Absolutely. So, going to the heart of your question, I was homeless when I was 16. So, I think that if I had to sort of replay in my mind what I would do differently in this experience that I had, is that I think I would have really appreciated, Michael said, look, the greatest thing was being a dad. I loved being a dad, but I really didn't recognize the amazing power of being a dad.
And it's kind of hard to, right? A saying that said, I forgot who said it, but he said, the days are long, but the years are short.
That's right.
All of a sudden you go through these days where you're grinding it out. You're trying to do what you can to provide the family, to provide more income, whatever it is, so on and so forth. You go through the days are stressful. You come home, kids are yelling, whatever, wife gets on wife gets on your nerves, so on and so forth. Real life issues.
Right.
Feel like long days, and all of a sudden you look up and you have a moment like you did, and you,
it's over.
More than others, it's time's up.
Yeah,
right?
and I think that I would have sooner, while I was climbing the corporate, gauntlet and trying to do all the things that I believed my family wanted to do to provide a life for them and give them the kind of, if I knew then what I ended up knowing at the time in which Key had transitioned, I would have been even a better dad. My kids would tell you that I'm a great dad in their opinion, but when I evaluate my own fatherhood, there were some things that I could have done differently. Not that I live with regrets.
Yeah.
It's just that.
But it's about lessons. Lessons you can learn for yourself and lessons you can pass on to others. That's what I took from this book. I was like, I can improve as a father a lot. I was like, now looking at this, because we fall into these same traps day to day. All of us do if we're not careful.
It is reflective. And by the way, I think, I know that all of the fathers, including Michael, would say this, but we don't want any other man to be part of this club. We don't want to welcome any new members.
No, I hear you.
If it was only us 10, we would be fine, and only 7 could participate in the book. I don't know.
But inevitably there will be.
Yes, there will be. And here's the point. The 3 men that didn't participate in the book, 2 of them, we got to the point of actually being able to interview them. They said, I cannot do this. I cannot talk about this. I have not been able to talk about it since they died, and I can't talk about it now. I want to, but I can't. And the other father, the third person in that triad, he was ready to talk about it. He had lost his daughter in October, so right after Krista, he lost Danielle. And he was ready to talk about it. And then in January, when we had our pre-meeting, his wife died.
Right.
And so I said to him,
wow, that's a lot.
I said, listen, I can't even allow you to participate in this book, because guess what? You're not in the frame of mind where you're going to be able to get through this, because this is hard work.
Yeah.
People have asked Michael and I, we had a conversation when we were on the book tour, early part of the book tour in LA, and we both came to that particular evening saying, I don't know if I can get through this evening.
Right.
Because every time we do it, it's hard.
I'm sure.
But the only reason that we do it, and the reason that we want to do things like your podcast, and we're so grateful that you've given us a platform to do this, is because we believe that there are people out there that need to understand how to navigate not only the journey loss, but the loss that black men feel every day. Loss of job, loss of dignity, loss of respect, loss of feeling out of control. Not out of control emotionally, but not having control over their destiny.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we talk about loss in a broader sense, and we take that message of loss of our children to the fact that, yes, you can celebrate a child if you've lost them.
And I certainly want to get to David Noak's story, because I think that goes to a lot of it.
Yes.
Finish your point, and we'll get there later, but I have a couple follow-ups.
Yeah, David's story is a compelling one for all of us. And I've known David 55 years. Yeah. But the reality is that we believe, all of us, and there are some of us in the collective, which is what we call ourselves, that have never been able to participate in any of the parts of the book tour.
I get it.
Because we've gotten all from them that they have to give.
Yeah, it makes sense.
They have nothing left.
As you said, the path is the path, the process is the process.
Yeah.
People have a different path, a different process for how they go through grieving.
That's right.
The important thing is to acknowledge that you need to grieve, though, and be vulnerable.
Right.
And the fact that some of your participants even went through this is amazing, because a lot of people can do it. I'm not sure if I could too, and I consider myself a pretty strong person.
Right.
Couple of follow-up questions to what you guys said. 2, how do you advise someone who is dealing with this issue? You've talked about folks that are that even in your circle that have even done this. that are still struggling. There are people that are on a different part of that spectrum who might be in deep depression. I'm sure you both have some feeling of where they're at, because I imagine have been there, and from what I read, you've had to move past there and take yourself past there in days when you have days that are challenging, when a memory comes up or something sparks it. I'm sure.
I still cry every day.
Yeah. My question is, I guess that's the first question. How do you deal with that, and what is your advice to others who are dealing with a similar issue? Second question, kind of related. Particularly for Michael, but both of you are men of faith, as I am. And I think both of you have said this has strengthened your relationship with God, strengthened your relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
My question is, how, given the result, being really honest, right? How, given the result that, you prayed and prayed and you were faithful, you followed the path, and things didn't turn out how you would have given everything to make sure that they did.
Yeah.
Those two questions, if you can take either order you like, but I think those are two questions.
I'll take the second one, and Michael, you take the first one. So given the result,
I want you to answer both. Don't worry, we got time.
We
answer
got
both. We got another 30 minutes.
We got one person in our collective who lost both his children, Lavelle Thornton, and Lavelle is a strong man of faith. And initially, he was mad at God.
Yeah.
And he said so.
It's understandable.
Right? But I think for him, just like us, I was never mad at God about Kia, because what I realize is the journey of a person of faith is one of rocky roads. It is fraught with disappointment. And even though you may pray for something, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It only means that you're demonstrating that you believe enough in your faith and the foundation of your faith that if anybody can handle it, God can.
Right.
But it may not be in his purview. And by the way, because he is God and you're not, then therefore you don't know the outcome. So the only thing you can do is,
and you can't see the whole picture.
You cannot.
You only have a partial view,
snippet,
a really small one.
Yeah,
like
very small one, and it's selfish, because by the way, because he can see everything. If you believe that, then you believe that he sees the entire puzzle of how this piece called Kia fits into that puzzle.
Right.
And so you don't have the luxury of that. The second part of that,
and I also say, just looking at, and often I think with the way we can see it as people is that sometimes life only makes sense looking back. And you can see it sometimes and you're like, why in the world didn't I get that job? Right. And then you're like, oh my God, thank God I didn't get that job. But you can't tell until sometimes 20 years later. And then, of course, God, you have eternity.
It was real time for me. So I was a candidate to be the president of a university the year that Kia was diagnosed. We were going through the process. The final decision came down in April. Kia was diagnosed in February. In April, I was one of two men left standing for the job. Everything pointed to the fact I was going to get the job.
Right.
Everything.
Right.
And then I didn't get the job.
Yeah.
And I thought, I called them all kinds of names under my breath, because I was like, how could you do that? How could that not happen? Even though Kia had been diagnosed, I had no concept that she would not make it through. Yes. My brain would not accept the fact that she wasn't going to be here. So that would have just been, I was going to get the job and I was going to move her to wherever I was going. Right. And she was going to be with me and her son, and we were going to make it happen. But then, realizing that when she passed away in July, it made a lot of sense to me why I didn't get that job in April. Yeah. Because I was in no condition in July and forward to run a university or run anything for that matter. I had to piece myself back together. There was a time I just shut myself off from everything because I just could not accept that I was not going to talk to my daughter again on this side. So, what I would say is that I think coming to the realization, the role of who God really is despite the outcome, it's your realization that you live in the spirit realm. You're here physically, but God is a spirit, and therefore you can't see that, you can't control that, you can't do anything about that, because the kinds of things that affect the spirit world are not visible to our eyes.
Is that also how you coped with it? Your faith and your spirituality is how you went through the coming out of depression?
It is. It's how I said to myself, okay, God, you're going to have to help me understand this. Now, mind you, it took a toll on my body. I got shingles.
Oh, wow.
I had a heart attack. There were a number of physical things that happened to me after she passed away.
Sure, it makes sense.
Some of it while I was writing the book.
Yeah.
And the point is that, I learned a great deal about myself. So as a man, when I think about, what advice would I give to people, I would say, you must find a foundation, a place where you can find strength. I use the metaphor often about having a cup like we have here. And oftentimes you give so much that the cup is empty. And if you don't have things that refill that cup, it will continue to be dry.
Right.
My faith, and I know this about Michael B. and most of the men in the collective, is that they have found their faith to be a reservoir of replenishment, a way in which to refill that cup. So you have to find something. If it's not God, you need to find something.
You need to find a community. You need to find something that gives you an anchor, a strength that you can lean on.
That's right. The second thing you must do is recognize that celebrating your children is as good an antidote for focusing on and being connected to them forever, celebrating them as opposed to mourning them.
Celebrating as opposed to mourning.
Right. What I said in the beginning of the book, and we actually do a promo we have that we did for the website, is we said, this book is not about mourning. And you said earlier on, it's hard to get through. It's only hard to get through for many people because they approach it from a place of sadness.
Sure.
We didn't approach it from a place of sadness. That didn't mean that we weren't sad along the way.
No, it makes sense.
But we approached it from
there's certainly hope in the book too.
Yeah, it's a
once you get past you can get past the material.
The gravity of what happened.
It's gravity. It's
is what sort of shakes you, right?
Yeah, some of the stories you're reading, it just I can't remember which father it was, but somebody died earlier. I said, wait, somebody else is about to die, and that's what I was looking at, and I was like. So you
Ralph,
feel that it coming.
Ralph's daughter, Marla. Now Marla used to babysit Kia.
Wow.
Okay, and Marla has been gone 25 years. She died in a plane crash. But what happened was that Marla's boyfriend, fiance.
Yeah, I remember this
was a pastor. Rufus.
Yep.
And Rufus was about to be ordained. She was going to his ordination in Pittsburgh from Chicago.
Yep.
When she was in law school, and then a year and a half later, he dies.
Yep.
And the point is, you go, wow. And he told Ralph, he said, man, I just don't know if I could live without Marla. And sure enough, he didn't.
Wow. That's Michael. So particularly, we've had conversations offline talking about faith and faith not being tied to the outcome.
Yeah, I was just
about that.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. Is that one of the things that I learned from Krista in the process is she's the one that she had a really telling conversations like with her doctor one time, and they were giving her all kinds of information about why they would or would not do or would or did or didn't want to do additional treatments. And one doctor said to her, and she was on a breathing mask at this time, one doctor said to her, well, I understand. She said, no, you don't. I'm on this side of the mask. You're on the other side of the mask. Right. I understand. And so Krista being on that side of the mask, when she continued to have hope and to have faith, to her last breath, of which I was holding her when she took her last breath, that taught me something. And what it taught me was you can't get too caught up or tied to the outcome of your prayer.
Right.
Your job is just to pray and to be faithful. And God will always be faithful. And so whatever the outcome of your prayer is what you have to accept. And it doesn't mean that you don't. I prayed until my daughter took her last breath that she would live. She hoped until she took her last breath that she would live. But she didn't. And my faith grew because I started to understand that faithfulness is not about the outcome of your prayer. God is not a God that you just simply give your wish list to and he brings you gifts.
He's not Santa Claus.
I don't want to go there, but so
Santa Claus is something we make to make ourselves feel better. Yeah, go ahead.
So you got to be careful.
Sorry, kids, be listening. Go ahead.
So you got to be careful not to allow not to get too tied to the outcome of your prayer. And if you don't, and you recognize that, and I think about, just to use the book in context, everybody in the book loved their children. I would take a bullet. I'd take a bunch of bullets for any of my children.
Right.
And if I had the capability to feel that kind of love and willingness to sacrifice for my child, I cannot even imagine how much God loves me.
Exactly.
And so the faithfulness of God is perfect. And so I have to be careful that even when that sometimes God can't give me what I pray for because it is not in my best interest.
Right.
And while it is hard to accept the fact that Krista's moving through this life over a 28-year period, it was not what I wanted, but it fell. It falls in God's plan for the benefit of everybody, including her. Then I'm okay, because it allows you to be faithful,
right?
And
we talked about this
pray.
too, Michael. Like the fact is, if your relationship with God or with anyone for that matter, because if your relationship is just about an outcome, it's not even a real relationship. It's a transaction.
Absolutely.
It's like I give you the prayers to get the outcome.
It's quid pro quo,
right?
It's quid pro quo.
That's not a relationship,
that's
right?
What it is. That's not a relationship.
Right.
Relationships are binary.
Well, relationships are covenants. Right. We live in a culture that is very contractual.
Yep.
You do this and I do that.
Right.
Yep.
And if you don't do what you contractually commit yourself to doing, then there's a penalty.
Yep.
But there is no penalty in a covenant. And relationships work that are covenants. They don't work when they're contractual.
Right.
So that's the thing that I think.
And that goes to our kids too. I just came up with this, right? Like, if I give you this, I provide for you, then you should do what I want you to do in your career and your pursuits.
Which is really problematic.
It's really problematic. I want to tell this one story, and my older and Maria and my son Michael will probably be mad at this, but I told Maria, you get a car based on the scholarships you get in college. She got some scholarships. She multiplied those scholarships times 4. Said, "Dad, I want to be in W." I said, No, baby. That's a scholarship.
Hey, she played. Hey, she.
I said, I'm buying.
Yes, she is. He got
I'm buying a car that is the equivalent of 1 year's scholarship.
Right.
And so we had all that. My son, on the other hand, struggled through college a little bit. And I had to give him some stories and let him know that, hey, Dad struggled too. And when I bought him a car, I said, you're getting this car you didn't have to do anything to get this car. You're getting this car because I love you.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Period. End of story.
Right.
There is nothing that I do for you that you have to earn. My love is free.
Right.
And I'm going to do what I do because I love you.
Right.
Period. End of story.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that you don't create relationships where your children earn things.
Right, because you got to teach them incentives and things like that.
All that's good. But at the end of the day, your relationship with your child or any relationship, that covenant is the foundation is love. And you do what you do because you love them. Even when you have this, you earn things and you end up giving them something based on what they do to earn it, it's still given because of love.
Yeah.
Well, that's an important point, and you didn't mention this yet, Rob, but I think it's a nice opportunity to mention one of the chapters in the book is called Not One Without the Other. And the reason that particular chapter came to me was that I really wanted to emphasize the fact that the most important thing we can do for a child, both mother and father, even if you're not together, is the nurturing of that child. That once you have a child, I don't care how you feel about each other, you need to make sure that your practices and the way in which you approach parenting is predicated on the love that you both have for the child. It doesn't mean that one gets to punish the other. It doesn't mean that you get to, withhold a time if you happen to be the parent who is with the child. We have a lot of conflict in the Black community about children. Children get put in the middle of these situations. The mother says, "I want to take my child, and you're not going to see him or her until I say so, until you pay more child support." That is dangerous.
That is dangerous, and I want to get to that point a little more. My mother has said this to me all the time, and being divorced and now being in a good relationship, I can definitely say it's a true statement. She said, "Who you choose as a partner or a spouse will be 90% of your pleasure or your pain."
That's right.
Choose wisely, son.
Wow, that's profound.
That's
profound. And true.
That is very true. That
is profound, though.
Very true. But I was talking about, this idea of not one without the other. And, we hear a lot, another myth that circulates in the Black community that's used actually in all kinds of diagnostic and empirical data analysis is that there's so many single moms, there's no fathers in the house, and the reason that the children are dysfunctional is because there's no dad in the house.
That's what we hear all the time.
The reality of it is a lot of women choose to be single, and it's not because a man left them. Sometimes, many times, they often opt out from the father of their children, and it's their choice. Now, if they haven't found someone else that they'd like to share their life with, that's certainly understandable. But it doesn't suggest that the man always walked away from the children, which is the primary thesis that we use.
And it's an important lesson in multiple points. One, it's the negative image and narrative that's put out that the reason why the Black community are suffering is because there's not enough Black male fathers.
That's
untrue.
Correct.
Second part that I think is really important is the pressures, the constructs that are put upon Black men. I think David Noak's story, am I saying the name right?
Yes.
Says it well when you and we're not going to get into all of his story because I want people to read the book.
Right.
But essentially, there are multiple layers. He had challenges with his ex-wife who put out a false narrative about him that the courts accepted as true without any evidence.
That's correct.
And with clear evidence showing otherwise.
Right.
Because it's so hard for people to accept to reject a reality that's been implanted.
Yes.
It's hard for Americans, it's hard for white Americans, but here's the key point for us. It's hard for Black Americans.
Absolutely.
It's hard for Black women and Black men to not buy into this negative stereotype. And I think one of the lessons that I've drawn from this book is that we have to make sure that we don't buy into this.
Absolutely.
That we begin to disrupt this because it's really hurting our communities. And we already have enough to deal with, but we have to figure out how we change internally. We can't change anything externally before we even change anything internally. That's right. That's one of the things I gathered from the book. You can tell me if I'm off on that.
No. I think you're right, and I think if you think about one of the other objectives that I try to be foundational to our writing was the idea that young Black men who are not yet fathers, what can they take away from the book?
Right.
Because one of the things that people often ask you is you read the book and you say, okay, so what? You wrote the book, okay.
Right.
So a very, very sort of direct view is that. So what's the importance of the book?
Right.
And one of the importance of the book is to say to young men, Black men particularly, who are not yet fathers, is that here are fathers that you can look at and look at our lives, and they look like you. They not only look like you physically, But many of them have had the same and have experienced some of the same things that you're experiencing. They've been poor, they've been black,
they've been discriminated against.
Yep. They've been divorced, they've been without love, they've been,
they didn't have a father in their lives.
They didn't have a father in their lives. All these characteristics exist. So I don't want you to think that this book doesn't apply to you, because this is you.
Yeah.
Now, if you've had an experience that was different, that's great. But the reality of it is most of us, much to our chagrin, have experienced many of the characteristics that make up this collective of men.
Or we know, if we don't know it directly, we know someone. We know somebody. I think everybody here can attest to that. Particularly, I want to think about David Noak's story. And one point I want to get on is the fact of what his son went through. For several reasons. One, the complications with the mother and what she put on those boys because of her negative experiences, probably, my guess is, with her father or with others, or her view of black men.
Right.
She put that on her children. She sounded like she might have had her own mental challenges and issues. And those were passed to her children. But society believed them, and then that ended up affecting his son, who went to jail for, I don't think something he should have gone to jail for that story. But here's the key point in that, I think the hope in that, is that his son still wanted to be a father. Despite all those things happening to him, he still wanted to be a father. So there's still, if he could find a way to want to be a father, more of us can also do that too. But how do you, because you said a point that I say every black man's story is in here one way or another. Someone who's going through a time where they're literally up against the things like David's son was. What advice and guidance would you give them at that point, knowing that things have been unfair to you? How do you go forward and still have a productive view as of society and as a father?
So the question.
My question makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But it suggests also that there is one way to do it potentially.
True.
And what I would say is that there is I could give you no answer that would satisfy the various complexities that would make up the story of all of us. What I would say, though, in terms of giving us, at least hope toward the future, is I always say that we should treat every conversation as a classroom. Every conversation we have with somebody, every book we read, every time we engage, every time we hear a story, how can we actually learn and get insight from that helps us on our journey? And I think that for the biggest Achilles heel sometimes for us as black men, and even us as people, particularly in America, where only 26% of all Americans read a couple of books a year.
Most of them get it from Facebook and Instagram and think they're informed. We got more information, but we're less informed as a culture, in my opinion. That's across the board, but go ahead.
You're right.
I had to just put that nugget there.
You're right. It's really to listen. It's to be a great listener and to continue to build on the knowledge that helps you navigate the world. We live in a knowledge economy now. We don't live in a tech economy or a capitalistic economy. We live in a knowledge economy. And what that simply means is that we're not taught really how to compound learning, not information, because information is noise. We get a lot of information. But knowledge is actually something to be applied, something to be taken for and put in our daily bucket and actually work it through, see how it works out.
Right.
Well, if you took the book and you said, I got 7 men who have given me some insight into what black fatherhood is from their perspective and their journey, that's knowledge. Now, how can I apply that to my own life? What are the lessons? I mean, you mentioned some of them at the outset of our conversation together here about what you've taken away from the book. The question is can we encourage each other to look for resources? Mental health counseling is another opportunity. If
someone was just very, because this is what you do as a line of profession, they're looking for help, they're looking for guidance. Is there anywhere they can go online? Any suggestions or resources they can use? I think it's important that we give them that. What do you? Where should they go?
So
beyond reading the book,
right? If you never read the book, but you came by March of this year, we're going to be launching a private portal where you can actually go in and request a consultation for free.
Okay, when that's ready, let me know. I'll post it on
from a mental health counselor, because what we know is that the myth is, and actually the factual basis, many of us do not seek out mental health counseling.
We're told lots of we got to be tough. We're also told, I think, we all talked about our faith. I think
God will work it out.
Yeah, that's right. Just pray away.
Yeah, just God will work it out. No, God is not going to work it out.
Yeah.
I just want you to know, it's not that He won't be available to you, but He's not going to work out the mental gymnastics that you're playing in your head about why this is happening to you.
Well, the story that my mother, always said, and I'll get to the brief part of it. She said, there's that story when someone said there was a flood coming. He said, well, what am I supposed to do? And the car came up, do you need a ride?
Right.
And then somebody else called and said, do you need something else?
Yes.
He went to the roof. The flood went to the roof, and then the helicopter came and said, do you need some help? He said, no, I'm waiting on God.
Yeah.
And then the person died and said, well, what happened? Well, said, fool, did you see what I said?
I sent you a car, I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter, and you still didn't know it. And so oftentimes we're blinded by even the help resources that are available to us. So if you David would tell you that this was one of the most challenging, but yet one of the most helpful processes that he's gone through since David Jr. passed away.
Right.
But what he'd also tell you is that, I asked him one day, I said, how do you feel about God? And he said, I don't hate God, I'm just confused.
All of us have honestly. I hope some. I don't think anybody's speaking honestly. They haven't been there before.
Exactly.
Even I haven't been through your level of tragedy.
Right.
But I've been there before too.
Yeah, and I think what I love about him in that regard is that he is about as authentic as you can get. I mean, David is raw. He is always going to be real with you. You're not going to get, he's not going to sugarcoat it.
I got that from the book too.
He's just not going to do that. And when I was doing the editing, because I edited all the stories, when I was doing the editing, there were things that David had in his chapter. I said,
you gotta take that out. Hey, bro, we can't say that. There's some limits. Yeah. I'm glad you're honest, but we don't need to tell.
I can't say that, David, because they're not gonna understand what you're trying to say. I get it.
Yeah.
Because you're my boy. But I want to make sure that we don't get somebody moving too far to the other side about what you're saying. But the point is that I think having a conversation like the one we're having today is another opportunity. Is how do we bring men together to have open and honest conversations? Because we don't trust that people won't use what we feel against
us. Exactly.
And therefore, finding a safe space in which to have this conversation. We have this collective of men. We have all laid it bare.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most wonderful thing.
And can I say a point on that? Because I think, and I want you to get back to that, is as we develop, one of the things I had to learn is that when you have relationships, if you're open first, I'm just talking about any type of relationship, you're open, know that there's going to be people that are going to take advantage of that.
That's right.
But if your view of the world is that I can't do this because I will get taken advantage of, then you will miss a lot of great opportunities to develop great relationships, great knowledge, great advice, because you've allowed yourself to be jaded by 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, how many experiences. That's not representative of the sample of the world.
You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, I take it even to the next level to say that you should be fearless about being able to.
Statement really quick. Sorry. Just pause that last statement. You're making really fast.
All right.
Yep.
You should be fearless. That's what you started.
Right.
And then we'll get ready to wrap up. I have one final question, essentially. Then we'll wrap up for both of you guys.
You should be fearless about the level of confidence you have about being authentically real, who you are. You should always strive to get people to see who you really are, because then you don't have to fake it.
Right.
Then you don't have to put on any airs. You don't have to,
it requires you to know we're not going to go down this path because it takes too long, but it also requires you to know and be self-aware of who you are to be there. And that's a whole nother struggle and journey and continual challenge that I promise we need to have another podcast on. Okay.
I got it.
Yep.
I got it. But anyway, I would say that the book really also speaks to women. It doesn't just speak to black men.
Tell me what you mean by that.
It speaks to black women about giving them some insight into who we are, because many women look at men from their lens.
Yeah. As we tend to look at women from our lens. Makes sense.
Right. But the real opportunity for growth is when you can suspend your lens and actually take in new information that reshapes it. And that is the journey of learning. That is the opportunity to engage and really take into consideration there are other variables that you hadn't considered. We hope that the book, frankly, we've gotten a lot of women, even here in DC, when we had the book event here in DC, one of the women stood up and she said, so how can I help my man?
Right.
We haven't lost a child, but just how do I communicate with him? And my answer to her was, I want you to think about how good a listener you are. Because one of the most interesting things about us as black men is that we don't feel heard. We often feel like nobody's going to listen, so what's the point? But the point is that when you have someone in your life who is committed to you, you committed to them, that actually being a great listener, being willing to hear them, hear that voice, hear that pain, those are the things that make a difference in relationships. When a man feels heard, he can actually navigate the world just a little bit easier after you've listened to him.
That's so true. I can say that I see that now, which I didn't realize in a relationship, having someone who is a really great listener. Yeah. That's a very profound and a very true statement. Final question for both of you. As you look at this book, you creating the book and your contribution to it, I want to ask you both of you, if you had a billboard or Google ad to be more current to the times that symbolize a statement, your belief system, whatever, based upon this book or based on your personal philosophy, what would that say and why?
Let me start. Okay. Well, I think there are two things, and this kind of relates to some of the other things that we talked about earlier. And one is perspective. One of the things that I think is hard to do is to get perspective. I heard something the other day. Sterling K. Brown, I believe his name is, the gentleman that's on
This Is Us.
On This Is Us. And he commented about his father. He lost his father when he was 10 years old. And he had a smile on his face. And he said the last thing the last interaction between he and his father had a massive heart attack. They were taking his father out, and his father winked at him. And that was the last thing. And he said he's raising his children. He has a son now who's 10 years old. He said, I know exactly what I need to do up until my kids are 10 years old. He said, after that, I'm on more. He said, but I had an incredible opportunity to learn from a man for 10 years. And I thought this guy was just happy that he had his father for 10 years. Mm-hmm. I thought about, I had Krista for almost 3 times that long. Mm-hmm. Wow. Right. I had an incredible relationship with this wonderful young lady who happened to be a product of me for almost 30 years. Right. Wow. Mm-hmm. How wonderful is that? And that's perspective. That's perspective. Yep. And now, since I heard Sterling K. Brown's point about his 10-year relationship with his father, I feel really good about those 28 and a half years. Right. The other thing is that one of the things that Krista taught me during this time period, not just while she was sick, but particularly during this time period, I go back and read some of her Facebook posts or texts she sent me, particularly during college, is forgiveness. Is being able to just forgive because, period.
Just forgive because.
Just forgive.
Period.
Because, and one of the things that forgiveness does is that it forces / allows you to see pieces of people that are the good parts of those persons. And one of the things that she said, she put in a Facebook post about me when she was in college. She said, I thank God for my daddy. She always called me daddy, and the other two call me dad. Mm-hmm. I thank God for my daddy for teaching me to see the good in people, even when it doesn't show all the time. Mm-hmm. And so, but most of that is really all about forgiveness. I mentioned to Rob a little earlier, and I think I've said this to you before, Larry, is that I did this study on forgiveness during a really difficult time in my life. And what part of that I found was that the Lord's Prayer, very centerpiece of that, is about forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And the first part of that is, Lord, forgive me for the things I've done. You know,
starts with self-awareness.
Yeah,
I didn't see that.
If you recognize that you're a pain in the behind, no matter how good you are, to at least one person.
Probably more than one, but go ahead.
Probably more than one, but at least one.
Definitely more than one.
Yeah.
At least one. It allows you to give forgiveness to others so much easier, you know. And so living a life of forgiveness and constantly asking for forgiveness and constantly giving forgiveness. You know, those are the things I think that as this whole notion of perspective, if you're a black man, and then this other notion of forgiveness, including yourself.
Yeah.
Including yourself. You know,
yeah.
and so, you know, I didn't even know who my dad was a wonderful person. I didn't even know who my dad was till I was 13 years old.
Wow.
And my dad spent a lot of time in the latter part of his life saying to me, "I'm sorry that I wasn't there for you." And in the last week of his life, I said, "Dad, you gotta forgive yourself, man. I forgive you. I'm fine. I love you. You're a wonderful person. You nobody wakes up and says, let me see if I can screw up somebody's life today. No, nobody does that.
Right.
Who's sane.
Right.
And so we have to be careful. We have to be careful to make sure that we practice forgiveness on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And my billboard would just say simply, celebrate every day.
Yeah.
What I really want in that context, particularly as it relates to black fathers, and I say this in a number of different ways, I want you, after reading the book, hearing about the book, or being exposed to this podcast, I want you to go home and hug your kids a little bit more. I want you to celebrate them. Don't talk about what their grades were or what they were not, or what they did wrong, or you know, the things that they didn't clean up their room properly. You know, one of the other most important things about black men, to the woman who asked the question, I said, not only be a good listener, but when is the last time you hugged him? You just hugged him. You just went to him and hugged him. There was no whole lot of conversation. There was no whole lot of anticipation. It wasn't sexual. It was a hug of comfort. It was a hug of a safe space. Men need to feel safe, no different than women need to feel safe.
Wow.
And we just need that. Sometimes we just need a hug. And by the way, we find in life, there are very few hugs come our way.
Yeah.
And the older we get, the fewer hugs we get. And sometimes it happens when we're kids. I certainly know that was the case for me. So if you don't have that, it's very difficult for you to give them. But when you become a father, you have to realize the importance of giving those hugs. But what women can do in our lives, those who love us and those who we love, they need to learn how to hug us too. And so being a great listener is important, but being able to exchange that hug. And therefore that means not hugging just your man, but also hugging your children. And every father, one father told me, he said, I read the book and I finished the book when I was at work, and I left my job and went to my kids' school, and the first thing I did was call them towards me and I just hugged them for a minute. I didn't say anything, I just hugged them. He said, because it was such a revelation to me to understand the importance of hugging my children.
Yep.
So when we see them, hug them.
Yeah.
That's a level of vulnerability that's important as well. So that's what my billboards would say.
Well, that's great. Dr. Lawrence Drake, Michael Bennett, the book is Color Him Father. I recommend it for anyone. I hope you read it. Thank you so much for listening.